I used to believe that silence was the price of peace. For decades I stayed quiet, convincing myself that love meant sacrifice, that devotion meant erasing myself so someone else could shine. My husband, Richard, never raised his hand against me, but his words, his indifference, and the way he dismissed me every single day left deeper scars than bruises ever could. There were nights when I lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, wondering if he even noticed that I was still alive. I had given him my youth, my strength, and the best years of my life, only to become invisible in his eyes. But what Richard never understood was that silence does not mean weakness. Inside me, a small ember refused to die. I didn't know it yet, but that ember would one day become a fire he could not ignore. This is the story of how I was destroyed, stepped on, and ignored, and how the man who thought I was nothing came to regret losing me. From the outside, our house looked like something out of a magazine. White columns framed the porch, roses lined the walkway, and the windows gleamed as if the glass itself had nothing to hide. Neighbors admired it, often telling me how lucky I was. They saw the polished wood floors, the antique furniture Richard collected, the paintings he bought at auctions. But what they could never see was the silence that swallowed me whole every time I stepped inside. The house was not quiet in the way a library is quiet, calm and filled with thought. It was quiet in the way a grave is quiet, cold, heavy, and final. At the dinner table, Richard would open his newspaper and spread it wide, a wall of print between us. He never asked about my day. He never cared if I had painted, written, or even dreamed. Those things were childish to him, a waste of time. My only role was to serve the meal, clear the dishes, and stay out of the way. Our bedroom was no different. The bed was large, but the space between us was larger. Richard would lie down, turn his back, and fall asleep without a word. Sometimes I watched the rise and fall of his shoulders, wondering if he even remembered the girl he once courted, the woman who once laughed freely in his arms. But that girl had been buried long ago beneath his indifference, and I was left with only fragments of her memory. On the morning of our anniversary, I let myself hope. 62 years old, and I still clung to hope like a child waiting for a miracle. I slipped into the blue dress he once said he liked, back when his eyes still saw me. I set the table with candles and polished the silver. I even bought a small cake, though I told the baker it was for a neighbor's celebration, so I wouldn't feel the sting of admitting the truth. When Richard came home, he didn't notice the dress or the table. He loosened his tie, dropped his briefcase on the chair, and poured himself a glass of bourbon. The ice clinked against the glass, sharp and indifferent, like the man holding it. "Is there something special tonight?" he asked finally, his eyes flicking toward the candles as if they were in his way. "It's our anniversary," I said softly, almost apologizing for reminding him. He frowned, sighed, then shrugged. "Oh, right. Well, you didn't need to make a fuss." That was all. No flowers, no card, not even the courtesy of pretending to remember. He sat down, ate in silence, and left the table before I had even finished my meal. When the dishes were cleared and the house was empty again, I stood by the window, staring out at the roses in the yard. Their petals were red and full, but their thorns were sharp. I caught my reflection in the glass, an aging woman with silver hair pinned neatly back, her eyes hollow, her mouth pressed into a line of restraint. I barely recognized her. That night I blew out the candles one by one, as if extinguishing every hope I had left. And in that darkness, I asked myself the question I had avoided for so long. Is this all there is? Is silence the only thing left for me? For the first time in years, I didn't know the answer. The morning after our forgotten anniversary, I stood before the mirror in my bedroom. The woman staring back at me was a stranger. Her hair, once thick and chestnut, had turned silver, swept neatly into a bun that no longer felt like a choice, but an obligation to look presentable. Her skin, lined and softened by time, told the story of years spent waiting for someone to see her, waiting for kindness, waiting for love. But the saddest part wasn't what time had done. It was the emptiness in her eyes. I lifted a hand to my face, tracing the lines around my mouth, the faint sagging beneath my eyes. I remembered the young woman I once was, the girl who loved to dance barefoot in the kitchen, the woman who dreamed of traveling, of painting, of filling her life with color. She had been vibrant, radiant, alive. Now she looked at me only through memories, trapped behind glass. Richard didn't notice my silence that morning. He buttoned his shirt, tied his tie, and left for work as if I were part of the wallpaper. I didn't even warrant a good morning. For him, I had become invisible, a presence that cooked, cleaned, and kept the house in order, but no longer held any value beyond that. When the door closed behind him, I walked through the rooms of our perfect house. Everything was spotless, carefully arranged, furniture polished, curtains drawn just so, rugs aligned. It was a museum of control, curated not for warmth or joy, but for appearances. Each room whispered his preferences, his tastes, his pride. Not mine. I realized with a heaviness in my chest that there was nothing in that house that truly belonged to me. Not even a corner where my spirit could breathe. Later that afternoon, I went into the garden needing air. That's when Claire Bennett, my neighbor, leaned over the fence. Claire was the kind of woman who wore jeans and loose blouses, her auburn hair falling in waves around her shoulders. She was 2 years younger than me, but carried herself with a kind of freedom I envied. She laughed easily, spoke boldly, and seemed unafraid of the world. "You look tired, Eleanor," she said, concern softening her voice. "Are you all right?" I forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just didn't sleep much." Claire studied me for a long moment. "I've lived next door for almost 15 years. I see the way you walk, how your shoulders slump a little more each season. Tell me something. When was the last time you felt alive?" Her question struck me like a stone. Alive. The word echoed in my mind. When had I last felt it? I couldn't remember. Not on anniversaries, not on birthdays, not in the quiet rituals of my marriage. It had been years, maybe decades. The realization left me breathless. That night, lying awake beside Richard's turned back, I thought of Claire's question again. I remembered the feel of a paintbrush in my hand, the smell of oils and turpentine, the way colors once spilled onto canvas like pieces of my soul made visible. I hadn't painted since my 20s. Richard had dismissed it as childish, and little by little, I'd packed my brushes away, convinced myself it was easier to give up than to fight. But now, as I stared into the dark ceiling, I felt a flicker, a memory, a longing, almost too faint to name. Maybe I wasn't entirely invisible. Maybe there was a part of me still waiting to be seen. Silence had become the soundtrack of my marriage. Not the peaceful kind, like waves brushing the shore, but the heavy kind that pressed down on my chest until it felt hard to breathe. That evening I prepared dinner as always. Roast chicken, potatoes, a salad arranged carefully on the side. I had learned long ago that food was one of the few ways Richard expressed approval. If the meal was done to his liking, he might nod once in acknowledgement. If not, the sharp curl of his mouth would say everything. We sat across from each other at the long oak table. He unfolded his newspaper, creating a barrier between us, and the only sound was the clink of cutlery against porcelain. I tried, cautiously, to break the silence. "I saw Ava today," I began, my voice tentative. "She asked if I could teach her how to bake cookies this weekend." Richard didn't lower the paper. "You spoil those children," he muttered. "They'll never learn discipline if you keep indulging them." I swallowed hard, staring at my plate. "She's only 8, Richard. She just wants to spend time with me." The paper rustled as he turned a page. "Nobody cares what you think, Eleanor." The words sliced deeper than he knew, though perhaps he intended them to. I sat frozen, my fork poised in mid-air, my appetite gone. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with all the years I had swallowed my voice, all the times I had let him decide who I was allowed to be. After dinner, when he retreated to his study with his bourbon, I cleared the plates alone. My hands moved mechanically, but inside something stirred. A quiet rage mixed with sorrow, an ache that words could no longer contain. Later, when the house was finally still, I went upstairs and opened the drawer of my nightstand. Inside lay an old leather-bound journal, one I hadn't touched in years. My fingers trembled as I lifted it out, brushing away a thin layer of dust. I sat on the edge of the bed, the lamp casting a warm circle of light, and opened to the first blank page. At first the pen felt foreign in my hand, as if I were learning to write for the first time, but then the words poured out. I wrote about the dinner, about the sting of Richard's words, about the years of being dismissed and ignored. I wrote until my hand ached, until tears blurred the ink and smeared across the page. For the first time in decades, I gave voice to the silence. When I finally closed the journal, pressing it to my chest, I felt both exhausted and strangely lighter. The house was still heavy with silence, but now I had a secret refuge, a place where my voice still existed, even if no one else could hear it. And though Richard would never know it, that small act of defiance, picking up a pen, was the first step toward reclaiming myself. The morning sun spilled across the garden, painting the roses with a light so warm that it almost made me forget the heaviness inside my chest. I stepped outside with a cup of tea, hoping the fresh air would soften the edges of my loneliness. The garden was the only place in the house that felt like mine. Every flower had been planted by my own hands, nurtured quietly when Richard was too busy to notice or care. I was kneeling to pull weeds when I heard Claire's voice drift over the fence. "Eleanor, you're always out here alone. Don't you ever get tired of keeping everything so perfect?" I looked up to see her leaning casually against the fence, her auburn hair catching the light. She had a way of appearing both relaxed and alert at the same time, as though the world could never fully intimidate her. I smiled faintly. "It gives me something to do." Claire tilted her head, studying me. "Something to do or something to hide behind?" Her words startled me. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. She continued, softer now. "I've lived next door for years, Eleanor. I see the way you move through life. It's like you're fading. When was the last time you felt alive?" Alive. The word echoed in my mind the way it had the night before. I set down my teacup, my hands trembling slightly. "I don't know," I admitted. My voice cracked on the truth. "It's been so long." Claire's eyes softened. "You deserve more than this. You always have." Her certainty unsettled me. For so many years, I had accepted that Richard's view of me was the truth, invisible, unimportant, unnecessary. To hear someone else suggest that I might still matter felt almost dangerous, as if touching fire after forgetting its heat. That night, lying awake beside Richard's steady breathing, I thought of Claire's question again. When had I last felt alive? I searched my memories. Not at holidays, not on birthdays, not in the small, cold rituals of marriage. The answer came in fragments, images of paint-stained hands, the scent of linseed oil, the thrill of watching a blank canvas transform under my brush. Painting. That was when I had felt alive. Long before Richard convinced me it was foolish. Long before I packed away my canvases in the attic, telling myself it was better to abandon dreams than to argue. The memory of color, of creation, stirred something inside me. I could almost feel the texture of a brush between my fingers, see the swirl of crimson against white. The longing was sharp, almost painful, but it was real. For the first time in decades, I realized there was still something left inside me that Richard hadn't managed to kill. Claire's question had cracked open a door I thought was locked forever. And behind that door, waiting patiently all these years, was the part of me that refused to be invisible. The attic had always been Richard's territory. He used it for boxes of old files, broken furniture he swore he would repair, and relics from his business trips that never meant anything to me. But that afternoon, after Claire's question had burrowed into my mind like a seed refusing to die, I found myself climbing the narrow stairs with a determination I hadn't felt in years. Dust hung in the air, catching the light that filtered through a small round window. The wooden floor creaked beneath my steps, as if the attic itself were surprised to feel my presence. I pulled aside a stack of boxes and found an old trunk pushed against the wall. My heart quickened. When I lifted the lid, a wave of memory rushed out, familiar, comforting, heartbreaking. Inside lay the brushes I had once held as though they were extensions of my hands. Tubes of dried paint, their caps rusted shut, sketchbooks filled with faded drawings, and beneath them, carefully wrapped in cloth, a canvas I had abandoned decades ago. I unrolled it slowly, my breath catching as the colors came into view. It was a painting of a meadow in late spring, unfinished but alive with strokes of green and gold. I remembered sitting by the window of our first home, working on it while the light shifted through the curtains. Back then, I believed Richard would support me, that he would smile at the woman who wanted to create something of her own. Instead, he had dismissed it as child's play, telling me my time was better spent on practical matters. I had believed him. I had put everything away. I had let myself be erased. Now, holding the canvas in my hands, I felt a sharp ache in my chest. It wasn't regret alone. It was hunger. A hunger for color, for expression, for life itself. I carried the trunk downstairs, heart pounding like I was committing a crime. In the corner of the sunroom, where Richard rarely went, I set up a small space with a table and an old chair. I cleaned the brushes as best I could, pried open a few tubes of paint that still held their color, and placed the unfinished meadow on the easel. For a long time I just stood there staring. My hands trembled as I lifted a brush, dipped it into paint, and touched it to the canvas. The stroke was uneven, shaky, but the sensation was electric. It was as if a part of me, buried alive for 40 years, had gasped for air. Time disappeared. The silence of the house became different, no longer oppressive, but filled with possibility. With each stroke, I felt myself re-emerging, not as Richard's wife, not as a woman erased by silence, but as Eleanor, the girl who once dreamed in color. When I finally stopped, the sun had shifted low in the sky. My hand ached, and my dress bore smudges of paint, but my heart was light for the first time in decades. Then from the hallway, I heard the familiar sound of Richard's shoes against the floorboards. My chest tightened. The smell of paint still lingered in the air, impossible to hide. The footsteps grew closer. I froze, brush still in my hand. And for the first time in years, I didn't know whether to feel fear or defiance. The smell of paint still lingered in the house when Richard returned that evening. I had cleaned the brushes, hidden the trunk back in the attic, and even cracked open the windows. But the scent clung stubbornly to the air like a secret unwilling to stay buried. At dinner, I placed his plate in front of him. Steak, steamed vegetables, a baked potato. My hands trembled slightly, but I forced myself to sit down as though everything were normal. Richard carved into his meal, chewed slowly, and then sniffed the air. His brow furrowed. "What's that smell?" he asked, his tone sharp. My heart thudded, but I met his eyes. I was painting. His fork paused midway to his mouth. He stared at me incredulous, as though I had confessed to something outrageous. "Painting?" "Yes," I said quietly but firmly. I found my old brushes. I thought I might try again. He set his fork down with deliberate slowness. "Eleanor, do you have any idea how ridiculous that sounds? You're 62 years old. You don't need to waste your time on childish hobbies." The words stung. But this time, I didn't lower my gaze. I kept my eyes fixed on his, steady and unflinching. "It isn't a hobby. It was once a part of who I was." Richard scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Who you were? That's nonsense. You're my wife. That's who you are. All this nonsense with paints. It's a distraction. You have responsibilities here. You don't need to embarrass yourself with fantasies." For years, I would have fallen silent. I would have swallowed his words, folded them into the pit of myself, and let them weigh me down until I could no longer move. But not this time. Not after feeling the brush in my hand. Not after the color had seeped back into my soul. "I don't care if you think it's foolish," I said, my voice steady despite the trembling inside me. "I'm going to paint again. I've already started." His eyes widened. Anger flickered across his face, the kind that had always kept me obedient in the past. But I did not look away. For the first time in decades, I met his fury with calm. The silence that followed was different than all the other silences we had shared. It wasn't heavy with oppression. It was charged with change. Richard finally picked up his fork again, his jaw tight. "You'll come to your senses," he muttered. "You always do." But he was wrong. Something had shifted, and I knew it. The Eleanor who had spent decades bowing her head no longer existed. That night, after he had gone to his study, I returned to the sunroom. I stood before the unfinished meadow, brush in hand, and whispered to myself, "He cannot take this from me." And as I pressed color onto the canvas, I realized the truth. This was not just painting. This was survival. When I submitted my painting to the local gallery, I told no one. Not Richard, not even Claire. It felt too fragile to share, like a secret seed pushing through the soil. If I said it aloud, it might die under the weight of doubt. The day of the exhibition, I nearly convinced myself not to go. I stood in front of the mirror, hands trembling, staring at a dress I hadn't worn in years. It was simple, soft cream with a faint floral pattern. I thought of putting it back, of hiding again. But then I remembered the brush in my hand, the colors that had returned to my soul. I owed it to myself to walk through those doors. When I arrived, my painting was hanging along the far wall. The meadow, my meadow. The strokes were imperfect, the colors a little uneven, but it was mine. My heart thudded as I watched strangers pause in front of it, tilting their heads, leaning closer. I braced myself for indifference, maybe even mockery. Instead, I heard whispers. "There's something alive in this one. Look at the light. It feels like hope." Hope. My painting carried hope. The word made my chest swell until I could hardly breathe. I hadn't noticed when Ava, Lucas, and Maya arrived with Claire. My grandchildren's faces lit up as they spotted my painting. Ava tugged my hand. "Grandma, that's yours. Everyone is looking at it." Lucas grinned proudly, his arm wrapped around little Maya, who stared wide-eyed at the canvas. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Tears stung my eyes, not because strangers admired my work, but because my grandchildren saw me, truly saw me, for perhaps the first time. I wasn't just their quiet grandmother who served cookies and tidied up. I was someone who created, someone who dared. When the gallery owner stepped forward and praised my piece, applause filled the room. The sound was overwhelming. For so long, silence had been my companion. Now the air vibrated with recognition, with voices acknowledging me. My hands shook, my heart soared, and I realized I was standing taller than I had in years. And then I saw him. Richard had entered quietly, but the storm in his eyes gave him away. He stood near the entrance, his jaw set, watching me surrounded by applause, my grandchildren tugging at my arms, Claire smiling proudly beside me. His face darkened with something between anger and disbelief. I felt his gaze pierce through the moment, threatening to unravel it, but I did not flinch. I looked back at him with steady eyes. The brushstrokes of my courage painted clearly across my soul. For the first time in our marriage, I was not afraid of Richard's disapproval. Not here, not now. Because in that gallery with applause ringing in my ears and 3 little hands clutching mine, I was no longer invisible. I was Eleanor Whitmore, and I was alive. The applause was still fading when Richard began to move through the crowd. His shoulders were squared, his steps sharp, his presence heavy enough to part the room without a word. I watched the smiles around me falter as people sensed the tension rolling off him like heat from a fire. My grandchildren clung tighter to my hands, their small bodies pressing against me for safety. He stopped just a few feet away, his voice low but hard enough to cut through the chatter. "Let's go home, Eleanor. This circus ends now." The air seemed to freeze. For years, I would have obeyed immediately, gathering my things, apologizing for the embarrassment, shrinking into myself until I was nothing but his shadow. But not tonight. Not here, where the walls were lined with color, where my children's children had just seen me shine. I straightened my shoulders, keeping my voice calm. "No, Richard, I'm staying." A flicker of disbelief crossed his face, quickly replaced by anger. He leaned closer, his words a hiss meant only for me. "Don't make a fool of yourself. You're embarrassing me." I lifted my chin, my voice steady. "For once, Richard, this isn't about you." The crowd shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between us. Claire stepped a little closer, her expression firm, as though ready to shield me if needed. But I didn't need protection anymore, not from him. Richard's jaw tightened. His voice rose, sharper now, unable to keep his fury contained. "Enough of this nonsense. You're my wife. You come home when I say so." For a heartbeat, the old fear threatened to rise in me, the habit of obedience, the instinct to shrink. But then I felt Ava's small hand squeeze mine. Lucas moved closer, his young face set with quiet defiance. Little Maya pressed her cheek against my arm, whispering, "Don't go, Grandma." And in that moment I realized I wasn't standing alone. I turned back to Richard, meeting his fury with the calm I had fought years to find. "You don't own me," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the gallery. "Not my choices, not my soul, not anymore." Gasps rippled through the room. Richard froze, his anger faltering into something I had never seen in him before. Fear. Not of me leaving, but of me no longer being afraid. For the first time in our long, suffocating marriage, I saw him small. His power, so carefully crafted over decades, cracked in an instant under the weight of my calm refusal. He turned sharply, muttering something under his breath, and stormed out of the gallery. The doors closed behind him, leaving only silence in his wake. But this silence was different. It wasn't heavy, it wasn't oppressive. It was filled with possibility, with the beating of my own heart, strong and free. I knelt to face my grandchildren. "It's all right," I whispered, brushing Maya's hair back from her face. "He can't hurt me anymore." They hugged me tightly, their warmth anchoring me in that moment. Claire touched my shoulder and gave me a nod of quiet pride. And for the first time in my life, I felt what true strength was. Not shouting, not control, not fear. Strength was calm, unshakable, undeniable. That night I walked out of the gallery not as Richard's wife, but as Eleanor Whitmore, the woman he could no longer silence. After the gallery night, I carried something home with me that I hadn't felt in decades: dignity. It wasn't just the applause or the kind words from strangers. It was the way my grandchildren had looked at me, their eyes wide, their voices proud, as if they had discovered a hero in someone they thought they already knew. The following weekend, Ava, Lucas, and Maya crowded into my sunroom, the one I had transformed into my studio. They tugged at my sleeves, eager to see the canvases stacked along the walls. The room smelled of paint and turpentine, but to them it must have felt like magic. "Grandma," Ava said, her eyes sparkling, "can you show us how you do it? How you make colors turn into pictures?" I smiled, pulling out 3 small sketch pads I had bought just for them. "Of course, but you don't make pictures. You let them find you. Sometimes the brush knows more than you do." They giggled at that, dipping brushes into jars of water, mixing colors that quickly turned into chaos. Maya painted swirls of pink and blue. Lucas sketched bold shapes that looked almost like castles, and Ava tried carefully to copy a flower from the garden. Their laughter filled the room, wrapping around me like a melody I had been starved of for too long. As I watched them, a realization settled deep inside me. This was what legacy truly was. Not wealth, not reputation, not the sterile perfection Richard demanded of his home. Legacy was passing on courage, teaching them to embrace color, to speak with their voices, to never let anyone dim their light. At one point, Ava set her brush down and looked up at me with an earnestness that pierced straight through my heart. "Grandma, you're my hero." The words hit me harder than any insult Richard had ever thrown my way. My throat tightened, my eyes blurred with tears. "Why do you say that, sweetheart?" "Because you don't let anyone stop you anymore," she said simply. "You do what makes you happy. I want to be like that." Lucas nodded, his little chin lifted with determination. "Me too. I'm not going to let anyone tell me what I can't do." Maya pressed her paint-covered fingers into my palm. "You're brave," she whispered. I gathered them into my arms, holding them close, my heart swelling with a kind of love that felt almost sacred. I had been invisible to my husband for so many years, but to these children, I was radiant. I mattered. Later that night, after the children had gone home with their mother, I found myself in the sunroom again, staring at the paintings drying against the walls. Their voices echoed in my mind, filling the silence with warmth. For the first time, I understood that my choices were no longer just about me. Every act of defiance, every brush stroke, every refusal to bow to Richard's control was a message to them. You have the right to exist fully. Don't let anyone take that away from you. Meanwhile, I knew Richard was in his study, brooding. I had seen him earlier, a glass of bourbon shaking slightly in his hand. He hadn't spoken much since the gallery, but the tension in his jaw, the sharp way he shut doors, told me everything. He was losing control, and he knew it. For years, his silence had suffocated me. Now it suffocated him. And in the reflection of my grandchildren's eyes, I finally saw myself, not invisible, not small, not forgotten. I saw a woman worth remembering. The morning light slipped through the curtains, casting pale gold across the living room. I sat quietly on the sofa, sipping tea, my sketchbook resting on my lap. The house no longer felt like a prison. With every brush stroke, with every laugh shared with my grandchildren, the walls had begun to lose their power over me. I heard Richard before I saw him. The uneven shuffle of his steps, the weight of hesitation in his movements. When he entered the room, I barely recognized him. His shoulders, once square and commanding, slumped forward. His face, usually hard with pride, was lined with exhaustion, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen before: desperation. "Eleanor, he began, his voice hoarse. "We need to talk." I set my cup down and closed the sketchbook, folding my hands neatly in my lap. "I'm listening." He stood there for a long moment, as if the words were too heavy to release. Then, with a suddenness that startled me, Richard dropped to his knees in front of me. The man who had towered over me for decades, the man whose approval I had begged for in silence, was now the one begging. "I was wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "All these years, I treated you like nothing. I didn't see you. I didn't value you. And now I'm losing you. Please, Eleanor, don't leave me. I can change." For a moment, I simply stared at him. My heart did not race the way it once had under his anger. Instead, it was calm, steady. I saw him not as the powerful figure who had silenced me for decades, but as a man undone by his own blindness. Tears slid down his cheeks, his hands clutching at mine. "I need you," he whispered. "I don't know who I am without you." I pulled my hands gently from his grasp. "Richard," I said softly, "you don't need me. You need control. And for years, you had it. But that time is over." His eyes widened, his breath quickening. "Eleanor, please. I can be different. I'll make it right." I shook my head, my voice firm but not unkind. "It's too late. You broke something that can't be repaired with apologies. You ignored me. You stepped on me. You erased me. And now when you finally see me, it's only because I no longer need you." Silence stretched between us, but it no longer belonged to him. It was mine now, calm, resolute, powerful. I rose from the sofa, looking down at the man who had once held my life in his grip. "You already lost me, Richard," I said, "and I won't lose myself again." Without another word, I walked out to the garden, the morning air cool against my skin. The roses were blooming, their petals opening toward the sun. I picked up a brush I had left on the table, dipped it into paint, and began a new canvas. Behind me, I could still hear him sobbing softly in the house. But ahead of me was color, light, and freedom, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was. The garden has become my sanctuary. The sunroom, once a forgotten corner of the house, now overflows with canvases leaning against the walls, each one a piece of me that had been buried for too long. The colors breathe where silence once ruled. Most afternoons, Ava, Lucas, and Maya run through the garden to join me. They chatter, laugh, dip their small brushes into water, and paint with abandon, unconcerned with perfection. Their joy is unfiltered, their confidence untouched by doubt. I watch them, my heart swelling, knowing they will grow up carrying pieces of my courage with them. When I was their age, I thought my life would be extraordinary. Somewhere along the way, I allowed myself to be diminished, silenced, made invisible. But life has a way of circling back, of giving us second chances, even when we least expect them. I think often of Richard. He still lingers in the house, quieter now, like a man who has lost his footing. He looks at me differently, with regret heavy in his eyes. But regret is not enough. Regret cannot erase decades of dismissal, cannot undo the countless nights I spent alone beside a man who refused to see me. I don't hate him. I don't even pity him. I simply no longer belong to him. Standing here in the garden, with the brush warm in my hand, and 3 little voices calling for me to look at their newest creations, I know the truth at last. I was never weak. I was never invisible. I only forgot how much I mattered. I turn to the children, smiling as they lift their paintings proudly toward the light. In their eyes, I am not a shadow, not a forgotten wife, not a silent woman. In their eyes, I am a beginning. I was destroyed, stepped on, and ignored. But now, I am finally seen, by them, by the world, and most importantly, by myself.